Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our penultimate brown bag of the semester. Next week, Carol Tate, one of our graduate students, will be speaking. It is my great pleasure to introduce Courtney Bell. Courtney Bell is Principal Research Scientist at ETS. She's one of the national and international experts in areas of teacher assessment and understanding teaching quality. We've been close friends and colleagues for quite a number of years, done a lot of collaborative efforts together as well. And she is going to talk about some important work today in the area of classroom observation, which she's done a lot of research, but specifically looking at special education teachers. So.
All right. Well, good morning. Are we in the morning? Yeah, we're still in the morning. I have known Drew since before he came to Rutgers, and we are good enough friends and have done enough like in the trenches research, painful data collection, also with Colleen, that I can say anything that bothers you about him probably bothers me too. So it's all among friends here.
This is being recorded.
We're going to send it to the provost. But today I'm actually going to talk about some work that Drew was not a part of, that we have an IS grant for with colleagues. I don't know if those of you who may know Nate Jones. I'm really curious, actually, before I start, will you raise your hand if you are a special educator, you teach special ed teachers, or sort of have a child maybe that has special needs? Okay, thanks. I was just really curious about, and then raise your hand if you're just a teacher educator. I'm curious sort of what the audience is a little bit. Teacher educators? All right, great. So welcome. A little bit to know about the audience. I am not a former special ed teacher, though I am a former high school teacher. So I don't bring the expertise of special ed to the table, though I've been hanging out with my colleagues, Mary Brownell. For those of you who are special ed people, you know Mary is a leader in the field of understanding special ed teaching. She's down at the University of Florida, and Nate Jones, who kind of sits, he also was a special educator and teaches special ed teachers at Boston. And he sort of works more in the assessment / policy space, but around special ed as well. It's one of his areas of expertise. So many of you know that observation systems are being used large scale here in New Jersey as well, sometimes with choice. Districts may be allowed to choose which one they use. In the states we'll talk with you about today, there are not any choices. You're using what the state chose for you and developed. But these systems really are this critical, they have been conceptualized and the policy has been aligned so that they are meant to be these tools that help evaluate teachers. And in theory, state officials, they don't mean this, they are not sarcastic when they say this, they really want the evaluation systems to help improve teaching as well. Now, whether or not teachers believe that that's what the system is for is a separate issue, but definitely the policy is pretty clear about that across the country. It is also, these observation systems and scores should help improve teaching, not just evaluate teaching. And so in many states, this information that comes from the tool, which usually comes in the form of numbers, scales, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like that on Danielson, or the notes that a teacher gets back that their administrator or maybe their special ed director wrote, that is supposed to be a signal to tell the teacher whether or not they need to improve, if they fell over some threshold, some number that the state views as important. It also is supposed to guide what professional development is supposed to happen in many states or in districts. And then finally, and this has been one of the most interesting things as a scholar to watch, is how it's supposed to shape the kind of conversation. So we're supposed to be talking about environment of respect and rapport and da-da-da. So it provides like a grammar to the conversations that previously, in many cases, were all over the map with whatever tool was being used. In general, districts do not use multiple observation systems. So they wouldn't adopt framework and then adopt, for those of you who are math people, MQI, which is Mathematical Quality of Instruction. It's a math-specific tool. Really, frankly, for logistical reasons, it's expensive. It's hard to get specialized people out to the classrooms, blah, blah, blah. But we don't know a lot about that, the trade-offs that are kind of inherent in that choice of just choosing a general tool. So it's sort of like, okay, administrator, you have a hammer, go forth, and please, improve teaching. And we don't know a ton from a research perspective about that choice of the hammer. and whether or not a hammer and a saw would have been better for that administrator. So there are observation score validity. I'll say more about what I mean by that term. Validity is really important, kind of regardless of how the scores are going to be used. And I think we can agree that in general, states have backed away some from the high stakesness of these observation tools. That has been happening partly because of the backlash, partly for lots of other reasons. But regardless of how they're going to be used, there's two kinds of uses that we really want to pay careful attention to because they're implicit no matter what the politics are. And the first one is high stakes teacher evaluation. So observation scores in many states, and I'll be curious to hear your guys' discussion about this in New Jersey and how it plays a role in the districts you're most familiar with. They tend to get aggregated up into some overall teacher evaluation score. And while we definitely have this retreat kind of happening, often there are still laws on the books about what happens if you fall in a certain category for that overall teacher evaluation score. So it matters how sort of valid and reliable that observation score is. It also matters for professional learning. So states are increasingly, especially now in the new reauthorization of ESSA, they're trying to use these federal dollars for coaching interventions. That's more and more the conversation. And so they're trying to take the systems they have, which are these, sort of large scale, very cumbersome teacher evaluation systems, and get something out of them that's like reasonable and practical. We got these systems, we spent 5 years putting them in place. Let's at least use the things for professional learning. So in theory, they're supposed to provide information about what should these teachers be working on or what should districts be working on. And so in theory, that second bullet would be true. Maybe they can guide professional development in productive directions. But if those scores are not accurate, that's going to be a problem, and we could wind up sending teachers down paths that frankly are not going to produce a lot of benefit for their students. That teachers might be able to earn continuing ed credits, but it may not be that useful for actually improving the quality of instruction and learning that happens. So you could wonder, why focus any study at this point on special ed? There's so many problems with teacher evaluation. Why not just focus on general ed? And there's a few reasons why we decided to focus on special ed. And this is a really non-trivial proportion of the teaching population, and it's growing in many cases, especially with kids being identified earlier and earlier. Empirically, special ed teachers have been often set to the side. That's what I mean by that word nuisance. Like researchers, myself included, we just say, okay, well, the sample's not going to include those people because we're not really sure what to do. Okay, not doing them. So that happens by states and districts actually do have very few shared practices for how to handle special ed teachers and teacher evaluation. And Nate and his colleague Allison did a review of how states handle special ed teachers in their teacher evaluation calculations. And it's not like there's like a standard way to handle special ed teachers. Okay, so when they're in pull-out instruction or when they're in co-teaching, we all do this. There's not widely held beliefs about that. And so there's a lot of making it up as we go, which is understandable when you're at the beginning of something, but is problematic if certain ways are better than other ways. And then in general, including the MET study, which so many people are willing to cite, and Drew and I both worked on it, and in our own work too, we just simply take those people right on out. We never recruit them into the study to begin with. Another reason to focus on them is that students with disabilities are a particularly poorly served population. And we have been failing them for a long time, despite the fact we actually lead the world. And now doing global research on teaching, I can tell you that we lead the world in trying to get kids with all different varieties into mainstreamed classrooms. So, but we do not see these gaps closing between kids that are identified and kids that are not. And the teaching strategies that we know from a ton of research, mostly in ed psych, we know that those specific strategies are not particularly well captured in some of these observation tools. I'll say more about that in a second. So we've got a very vulnerable population. We've got kind of ignoring or non-standardized practice associated with special ed teachers, and we've got a lot of them. So this is part of the reason we were really concerned about how does observation work for special ed teachers or not work. So in at least 34 states, according to some of the AAR's databases, suggest that they are using Danielson's framework for teaching. That doesn't mean the whole state is using it, but some proportion of districts are. Lots of states allow choice, districts to choose what tool they use. So that's a lot of, that's widespread use. When we got ready to frame the study, we started to look and sort of, you have these hunches as researchers and as humans, like, I think there's a there, I think there's something at issue to study. And then you start to dig in and you learn what others have done. And so Nate, our special ed team members, knew that there had been discussion about general ed protocols being used with special ed teachers, partly because they're using them in their teacher prep programs. And so we did an analysis that then helped frame the proposal that we wrote. So we took a look at the domains of Danielson, and we're going to focus just on domains 2 and domain 3, but teachers are often evaluated on all 4 domains and states. And these are the 5 components within environment and instruction that we were the most worried about. So we looked at the 4 scale points of Danielson, so it's rated 1 through 4, where 4 is better than 1. And in general, you would want your child's teachers to be around a 3. Like if we're using the scale properly, you wouldn't really be that excited if there are a lot of 2s happening for your teacher. Certainly beginners might be starting around that 1 or that 2 level as they begin, but definitely for your own child, you'd like them to be higher on that scale. So when we looked at the 3s and the 4s, the language in those 3s and 4s on the different, those 5 different components were concerning because they didn't map in clear ways to the things that Nate and Mary and others in special ed suggest are important for special ed students to accomplish. So at least as a primary order of business. So here's an example. So under the element of discussion techniques, which is underneath here in the domain of instruction. So if this is the 4 scale point, the descriptor there. So students assume considerable responsibility for the success of the discussion, initiating topics and making unsolicited contributions. So if you think to yourself, you're a special ed teacher, you're working with a 4th grader who is behind grade level, maybe has a high incidence learning disability, and it's a reading issue that they have. You're seeing that student because they have a reading issue. And it's very important for them to catch up and be at grade level in order to have access to the rest of the content in the curriculum, science, social, whatever. It's unlikely that this is going to be at the top of your list of what you're trying to accomplish with these kids. You're going to be trying to get them to decode properly, fluency, comprehension. Those are the kinds of things that you're going to be focusing on in your instruction. It's not to say that you don't want that for that child, and maybe even in the 4th grade, maybe even in reading, but the bulk of your work is going to need to be focused on getting that student up to certain kinds of grade level expectations. The same goes for activities and assignments. Just another example. All students are cognitively engaged in the activities and assignment in their exploration of content. Students initiate or adapt, that's the students adapting, activities and projects to enhance their learning. Again, it's not that that's undesirable in special education and general education as well, but we have to think about sort of how frequent is that going to be, how many lessons would we see that in, what grade level, etc. All those questions really come up in ways for special ed teachers that may be or may not be different for general ed teachers. So the research questions we started with are, to what extent do FFT scores provide valid, reliable scores of special educators' instruction? So the basic question, what evidence do we have? And then we're very interested because special ed teachers are often in these assigned, and they change, these teaching assignments. So you might be certified K-8 or K-12. And then wherever your district needs you, you're going to go to 6th grade and you're going to be working with the ELA, students with the ELA needs. You're going to be going to the 4th grade and you're focused on math. But often the special ed teacher has exactly zero control over that. And they're very specialized placements or assignments that they have. So these are some of the big ones that seem from a policy perspective and a teacher evaluation perspective important to us. So do scores vary by co-taught, which is common in Rhode Island and Idaho where we're doing this work, or self-contained classroom. We do have a few other teaching assignments, but we'll look at those 2 today. Elementary versus middle school, and then reading versus math. The third big research question is really about the extent to which scores on FFT correspond to scores on another observation tool that is specifically designed for high incidence disability. So it's developed in the special ed community. And so in theory, that tool captures, and there's that validity evidence for that tool captures what high quality special ed instruction is for high incidence disabilities, different than like more low incidence disabilities. Okay, so before I go forward though, there's something important. I want to unearth a common assumption that we often have lurking around in our brains as just people walking around, sometimes as researchers, definitely as policymakers. It's this idea that validity travels. And let me say what I mean by that. It's this kind of idea of like, if FFT has research that suggests it's valid and reliable in California, in Los Angeles, it's going to be valid and reliable in Newark. And that actually, that idea flies in the face of pretty much anything an assessment person would tell you. First, there's just practical things. Tools are not used the same way, nor are they implemented the same way. So that example I gave in Los Angeles, maybe the raters were trained very carefully, the principals were trained very carefully, but then when they go to do it in Newark, there's no money for training, and so the principals are using the scales really differently. So there's just practical differences between stakeholder goals and resources across contexts. And then finally, Mike Kane, who's a colleague at ETS and one of the giants in Validity, among others over the years, have really carefully tried to explain to themselves and others in the field that our goal in validation really is about taking the proposed score interpretation and use. So that's like, this score means this thing, and it's going to have this set of consequences associated with it. So it's very specific. It's that gets validated. It's that you have to collect evidence around, not the test, not the tool, not the sheets of paper. And so I say this because often people just sort of presume, well, isn't there just a lot of research on FFT? And what's underneath that assumption is actually that the research kind of travels along with the sheets of paper. And that's just not true from an assessment perspective. So Kane and others have argued for a long time, going back before 2006, that really we should be thinking about validity as an argument. And they actually refer back to very sophisticated argumentation kinds of work. But here you can also think of the argument in a simple way, that you lay out a set of ideas and you link them together with logic or evidence. And you're trying to say to yourself, to what degree do I believe this chain of logic, this chain of evidence? Do I think this thing holds together? And then can I make a judgment about that says, yeah, I think we can use the scores from this Danielson for this purpose. Again, it's the interpretation and use that you're worrying about. And that idea of argumentation makes people extremely uncomfortable. They want to know, is it valid or is it not valid? Full stop. They don't want to know this is like some murky business about you have to make a judgment. You have to integrate. No, thank you very much. So this is a very specific way of thinking about validity, but this is how validity scholars and certainly assessment people think about validity. It's a much more complicated thing than just there's a correlation to student learning and we're going to call it valid after that. That's not how it works. So this is the framework we bring to the work. And you can roughly think about there being 4 big kinds of inferences that are part of that causal chain or logical chain that I mentioned. So there's a scoring inference, and that's really about the degree to which the scores are appropriate, they're accurate, they're consistent, another word, reliable, they're biased in certain ways, statistically biased, otherwise biased. The second is the generalizability inference, and so to what degree can we say these lessons we observed can generalize to the thing we're interested in. In teacher evaluation, we're interested basically in 1 year of a teacher's performance for all the students she teaches. So we're trying to go from some number of lessons we happen to see, 2, 1, 4, I don't know, it depends on the rules in the state, and to say to what degree is that reasonable to take that little sample and generalize to that teacher for that year for all the kids, right? That's always an issue, the sample to the whole domain or universe thing. That's the second kind of inference. The third one is the extrapolation inference, which is sort of to what degree do these scores actually represent the level of the construct we care about, which in this case is teaching quality. So yeah, I can generalize to the teacher, but does that score have some meaning to this broader idea that I care about, which is about teaching quality? And in this case, we can look at stuff like student growth data, and in the state of Rhode Island, they have in their teacher evaluation system, they have student growth percentiles, which are different from value-added measures, but are conceptually related. They're still trying to figure out to what degree are kids moving up a certain amount in a year on standardized tests. And then another kind of data that we can bring to bear in this study is we can compare to other measures of that broader construct of teaching quality. And then finally, the last big inference is about interpretation. So how are these levels of teaching quality that we really care about, this is what we're really interested in, how are those things related to the consequences that are associated with a certain level? So if I say to you overall in your big teacher evaluation system, you're a 3, but you got a 3.1, are the consequences that go with that 3.1 okay with us? Is it reasonable? Do we have evidence to suggest that's reasonable? So that's the kind of big framework. And because we're working, the data were scored last year on these 2 observation tools. We're still doing analyses. I'm only going to share with you today a small amount of it. Some evidence around scoring inference, and some evidence about the relationship to the QCI, which was created by Chris Dobler and his colleagues. Yeah, okay. So that's the title of the project, Validating an Observation Instrument for Evaluating Special Educators, which we call VOISE. And the goal is to understand the validity argument for using FFT with special education teachers, realizing, of course, that the validity arguments amass over multiple studies. So this is just one study, and other people would find other evidence in other places with other implementations of Danielson's framework. So the design of the study is the following. So we videotaped 81 special ed teachers. They were all volunteers, so they could opt in or opt out, up to them, across Rhode Island and Idaho. And we have 4 lessons for almost every teacher during the 2016-2017 school year. Now, I mentioned to you, and especially those of you who train special ed teachers, you know that special ed teachers are not usually always in a single setting. They often are maybe first period or for the first part of the day, they're co-teaching, and then for 2 hours out of the day, they have kids coming to them in a resource room kind of context. So the way we decided on those 4 observations, we said to them, tell us the situations you're in, the assignments you're in, and we want to try to the degree possible, proportionally observe you in those settings. So if half of their time was spent co-teaching, we tried to go see 2 lessons in co-teaching. Because what we're interested in is kind of what a principal would have access to. So that's not great from a measurement perspective because it's very noisy. We didn't require everybody to do a co-teaching lesson and everybody to do a resource room. But that's the reality of how teacher evaluation works, is that the principal has them in a certain setting, and that's the setting he can go or she can go observe the teacher in. So we tried to match it onto that. So then all of the lessons or the videotapes were double scored by trained raters using the FFT framework. All the raters, I can tell you endlessly about the rater training, but they all had to be certified and meet certain reliability standards, and then we monitored them and blah, 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 blah. So then FFT scores are compared, I mentioned already, with the other special ed tool. We want to see if those ratings are similar. We also have had, I won't share the data today in the interest of time, but we've had an expert panel of special ed teachers look at those lessons and some of the ratings and say yes or no, we agree with what was given here. And then we just got the data from the state last week to look at the comparison between student achievement and student growth percentiles. So let me pause there about methods or questions about just the framing of the study, and then I'll tell you just 4 preliminary findings so we have some time to talk and think about what this may be. So go ahead, questions on the way we did it, why we did it that way, go for it.
So you're comparing the FFT, which is
General education, yeah, Danielson, yeah.
to 2 measures from special ed?
Just though, I'm going to share data with 1. We actually have 2, but we're messing around with how to scale the COSTI scores.
So
It's the QCI, yeah.
It's
It's made by Chris Dobler, and it's a very global measure about high incidence, kind of rapid, iterative instruction. Mary has another word that she calls that kind of instruction. It'll come to me. But essentially sort of this really well scaffolded, highly teacher directed, high incidence disability kind of stuff that they've done, not just Mary, but lots of people have done research on. And it has been, that kind of instruction has been shown to be very helpful for advancing kids in their IEPs. But I'll only share QCI with you today. COSTI measures these really small grained things, and we haven't figured out how to combine those scores well so that we can be comfortable with them. I have some papers on both of those two instruments that talk about the validity evidence for them if you're curious for yourself for whatever reason. All right, any other questions about setup?
So this, I'm sorry, so this is like 81 teachers?
81
And
teachers.
the 321 license?
Uh-huh.
So like each of them have like
Roughly
four-
four. Yeah,
Okay.
4 lessons for each teacher. Yeah, and one important thing to note, which we did, which is unusual to do with Dobler's instrument, they don't usually do this. We segmented each lesson into 15-minute, I'm gonna get my studies confused. Is it 15 or 20-minute chunks? I think it's 15 minutes in this study. We tend to segment lessons in general in the studies we do because there's a ton of research on cognitive demand for raters. And if you let them wait until a 45-minute lesson goes by, they are just mostly giving you a lot of like general impressions. They're really not giving you accurate scores about what they saw and paying careful attention to the evidence. And then we just usually average over. You can use IRT methods to try to figure out how to assign scores also. We have found that we've done, you know, kind of preliminary analysis. We have really gifted statisticians as our colleagues, and generally averaging works just fine, and people certainly understand it a lot better. So we average up to the lesson level, and then we average up with these scores up to the teacher level.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your 81 teachers?
Yeah.
Were they all in self-contained special education classes? Or were they in a variety of settings?
A variety of settings.
Okay.
The 3 main kinds of settings, and it was really hard. One of the downsides of how research on teacher evaluation has proceeded, and this won't surprise you, if you sort of hound a group of humans enough and make them feel demoralized, which in the case of Rhode Island is what happened when they implemented high stakes teacher evaluation. The state actually really did not intend for that to happen. They have quite a good State Department of Ed, very thoughtful and kind of on the side of teachers. They were led by a special educator herself, the person that was in charge of implementing it. So, but the point is, when that all happened under Race to the Top and that stuff, people became so demoralized. Teachers, when we went to go recruit, we actually had to ask for a 1-year extension for the study from IES. People were so unwilling to participate in the work. And nobody was going to see their scores. Nobody was going to anything. And in some ways, you can imagine this study would give them some evidence about some of the things that they were most frustrated about with being observed with the general tool. Because at least we could have some evidence about, like, okay, does it work? Does it not? Where does it work? What does my principal say? How does the stuff that these researchers got compared to the information we're getting back from our state policy system? But that actually didn't matter. People were extremely uninterested. So to answer the question, we only recruited 3rd through 8th grade. If they were assigned 3rd through 8th grade teachers, we didn't care what subject matter they were assigned to. And it varied. The most common setup was a resource room, the people who tended to say yes. But even those resource room people did co-teaching. Many of them also did co-teaching. And some of them did not like where they had a resource room and the kids came to them, but more like they would go into a classroom and pull 2 or 3 kids off to the side and do some targeted small group intervention. There were some teachers that had self-contained classrooms, so they had the same kids all day. And those, I think those are mostly the only sorts of setups that we have.
So how did you train your scorers given those variety of settings, right? So if you're using Danielson and you're looking at a co-teaching situation in a lot of classrooms and it looks totally different. And sometimes a special ed teacher doesn't teach, right? Like
at all.
Right. So
Teach.
so how did you manage
Sometimes
that?
they're like an aide. They're
Right.
almost like an administrative aide. Like, oh, could you go get the copies and write?
Yeah.
So we had a long conversation with the State Department in our decision about this because this was like a major methodological problem.
Yeah.
It also was a methodological problem. Like, first, what do we tell the teacher when we go to recruit them? But then what do we tell the video person who's capturing this thing? Like, do you follow everybody? Should you get both teachers on? Okay. So the first thing is when we talk to the State Department and we talk to the special ed directors group, so they have like Rhode Island is a really small state. Idaho didn't weigh in on this part. We made the decision based on the Rhode Island data. But the special ed group, that's a state level group, said, you know, the truth is administrators will often, unfortunately, say to a teacher, I'm going to evaluate you. I need to do an observation the next 2 weeks. Why don't you tell me when you're going to be leading the class? And for some special ed teachers, they have this kind of relationship where they would naturally lead the class at some point. But for many of the teachers, they're like, that's not ever how I'm used. I'm never the person leading this class. Like, so it's very contrived. So the special ed directors felt like, we don't want you to do the contrived thing. We want you to do the real thing. Because what we would really like to understand is if administrators were doing this in the way we would support, which is they go in and they observe how the teacher is being used, we would like to know to what degree do we have any validity evidence on Danielson for that. So that helped guide us to say, don't do anything special for us. Do what you're going to do. Now, when our research assistants would go out to the schools, either to, you know, finish the recruitment process, the teacher had said, yes, I'll participate. But then we came out, we talked to them about the camera, all this stuff, consent forms for them, for kids. When we did all that stuff, they would, of course, tell us all these things. And they're like, well, so what do you want me to do? What do you want to see? And so we would teach the research assistants to say back, yes, we just want you to see the regular stuff. And they would say, wow, but in this classroom, like, okay, you're going to do one observation and co-teaching, but, you know, I don't really do anything. You know, if she asks me for help, I give her help, but I don't do that much. So I am positive that some of those classes, so they were worried about it. Mm-hmm. So despite our assurances to the contrary, I am positive some of those teachers, like, had a little more of a role or a different role than what they normally would have, especially in that co-teaching setting. Now, I will see you, we were surprised. We expected to see more co-teaching. Mary, in particular, Brownell, who they have a lot more co-teaching in Florida, she really expected to see not only more but better co-teaching, more use of, like a real use of the special ed teacher in the co-teaching setting. There will be a paper from this that Mary's leading that really is about that, because it's one of the more depressing findings.
Yeah.
I don't know that finding generalizes outside of these 81 teachers, but that idea of, like, what are the practices of how we assign teachers in special ed, that there's not a lot of literature on that.
But how did you score them? Like that?
So how did we
there's
score
no
them?
NA option in Danielson.
No, there's not. So we told them to only base it on the evidence that mostly comes from that special ed teacher. So if a teacher was not really talking very much, like imagine that co-teaching situation, and looking at questioning, you know, if that teacher's not doing very much of that, then you don't give credit for something that doesn't exist for that teacher, because you wouldn't expect a principal. I mean, if the principal is using the tool faithfully, the principal wouldn't use it. So do I think that this has, like, maybe depressed scores? Perhaps. It's less than 15% of the lessons, I think, if I'm remembering right, that are co-teaching. I can double check that number. So I think the resource room situation, the situation where the teacher's off to the side with just a small group, and then the actual self-contained classroom, I think those scores are probably pretty appropriate. And those were not very hard for the raters at all, because the teacher's leading everything. But it's an open question. The other really important question, I think, here, which we'll get to in the end, is to what degree is what researchers tell their research team to do, those scores, to what degree is that similar or different from what actually happens when principals go to use these things? Right? Go ahead.
How are you, I'm curious, because you said that you're talking about high incidence disabilities. How are you demarcating what is a high incidence?
Yeah, so Mary and Nate, I'm going to get this probably pretty wrong, but so, like, some kind of emotional needs, special ed needs, and basically, like, learning disabilities that are not categorized as very severe. So, but that is the language, high incidence. Again, I'm not special ed kid, but high incidence special ed needs. That's how it was described when we would go to recruit. So we didn't have access to kids' IEPs. So I don't actually know. Actually, the raters would not have known which were the special ed kids in a co-teaching situation. So that's all invisible. It will be very interesting when we do now. I mentioned we got the data from the state. We don't have the IEPs that are associated with the state data, but what we do have is the number of students that are associated with that teacher that were identified. So we won't know the specific identification, but I don't know to what degree there's wide variation in, like, what the districts count as high incidence. If they basically thought it was a high incidence disability, that was fine with us, and we didn't press further, partly because what we're really interested in is teacher evaluation, and the principal has to use this tool for these kids. What we meant to try to get rid of by saying high incidence was more like if the school is for death, those kinds of places where administrators might not reasonably expect to use this tool. Turns out in Rhode Island, they are using this tool.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because I was evaluated with it when I was a teacher in D75 in New York City.
Okay.
The out-of-district program for kids with severe disabilities. So this is being used with those kids. We can talk about that later, but
Yeah, that's
many
fascinating.
teachers that teach students with low incidence disabilities are still being asked to do like questioning with like nonverbal preschoolers. Yeah. So we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. I didn't,
Just saying, not that I have like a bone to pick with that.
not that I have something to say about
Not
that.
that
or
I'm
anything.
personally traumatized.
Whatever your research finds. Yeah, well, that's an interesting. I didn't realize that was happening that much too in New York. That's interesting. All right, so one of the first interesting findings to us, which we did not really anticipate, was if you look, I don't know if this, let's see if this is the right pointer. Okay, here we go. So this is domain 2. That's the only reason this line is here. So this is the environment components, and these are the instruction components. So domains 2 and 3 in Danielson. These are just the means. This is just average across all the lessons, right? 1 to 4, 4 is high. So one of the things that was pretty interesting is if you just eyeball this, like round for yourself, closer to 3, closer to 2, and look at here, what is striking and was very striking to the special ed, my special ed colleagues on the team, was how low these were. Partly because they're low and some of the ones we didn't think would be particularly problematic. So these are the ones that we thought would be particularly problematic, especially at the high end, at the 3-4 end. We thought it might not make sense to see instruction like that in a certain kind of special ed setting. So these were the ones that we wondered about, and you can see this managing student behavior is. I will say to you one thing which maybe doesn't surprise the special ed teachers in the room. We did not see, again, self-selected sample of 4 lessons. We did not see a lot of behavior issues. We saw special ed teachers actually handling things, like that. But this questioning, you can see these are pretty low. Engaging students in learning. This one is a very interesting one we've talked about endlessly. So we talked about questioning. We'll come to that. So at any rate, those were the ones that we anticipated, and these are quite low. Let me give you a point. I'll show it to you a different way. So if you look at these distributions, this is domain 2, this is environment. And you can see even the distribution, these are for the special ed teachers, is shifted much more. Ooh, oh, shoot.
Don't touch it.
It shifted much more between the 2 and the 3, but if you look, this whole instructional distribution is shifted down. And Drew and I have done a lot of work, and others have as well. This is a low distribution in instruction. It's low in general ed too, always, in almost every study, although there are, in certain components, it may not be true. But overall, if you look at domain 3 in Danielson, in any study, you will see it is lower than domain 3 is lower than 2. Which for those of you who are general ed teachers, it's not surprising to you they can create a more proficient in Danielson language. That's the 3 environment, and they're struggling more in certain aspects of instruction. It's not surprising. Certainly our student achievement in this country suggests that. So this is just another way to look at this of the distributions, just to say what is the 90th percentile. One of the things that was pretty interesting is we have 2 other samples at our disposal because we've been doing other research. So this is a study that Drew and I did, and this is the MET study. And these are published means in other research papers. So this is a group in a large southeastern state, all middle school teachers. So you can't directly compare these because the samples are very different. And this is mostly urban school districts. In the MET study, but over 2,000 teachers here, and grades, I think 3 through 8 only in MET. So these are very different populations of folks, and there's some science in here, but only math and ELA here, and math and ELA, but in the research room case, they could have been doing whatever in that case, so more subjects here. But if you you just look across, what is interesting to us, just to sort of say, okay, within VOISE, our study, do we see a similar pattern as with UTQ and with MET? And this is the point I was making. Here, you know, around the 2 and here around the 2, you see a little 1 right here. But you can see here, we've got everything lower, but the relative difference between, we still see environment looking better, even across these other samples. So that's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you say to yourself, well, would you expect that to be similar or different for special ed teachers? Because the other 2 samples are all general ed teachers. There's not special ed teachers in those other 2 samples. So this gives us a little way to look, are these 2 big areas of teaching kind of similar? And yes, the short answer is yes, they are. But the means themselves can't be directly compared because of the sample issue. It is interesting, though, that you see quite a bit higher means here, right? So we care if raters are giving consistent ratings. So I mentioned everything is double scored. And so these are just exact agreements when 2 raters assign the same score. We have to deal with some averaging issues when we go up. But so again, this is a very, very common finding. In environment kinds of behaviors, raters agree more easily about what they see, and they have a harder time agreeing on what they see when they're looking at instruction. That's true in the VOISE work as well. These are low. These are not good numbers. They are the numbers that we see in the field, though. So this study is no different. These numbers look very similar in UTQ. In MET, I could rattle off another 5 studies. In Danielson, we just trained a whole bunch of raters in an international tool that the international raters developed. This 50% mark on a 4-point scale of exact agreement is around where we see things. And that's, you know, not great. It's a 4-point scale. Yeah. Now, it's also true that they're not. The other one that I don't share with you here is like, is what's the one-off agreement, because you care if people are always between 2 scores, but they're in the right part of the distribution of the 1 through 4. You feel better about that. You feel like that's a more accurate reflection versus if somebody's doing a 1 and a 4 and we just count that as not agreeing. The 1 and the 4 is like, okay, that's a very significant problem for accuracy, you know, of like what was happening in the classroom. I should add a column that does the one-off. So one-off actually looks pretty good, you know, much more like 90% one-off kinds of agreements. But the exact, it's hard. And for those of you who've used Danielson, those verbs and those nouns are very wide, and reasonable people could come to reasonable decisions about what's a 2 and what's a 3. And so they're one-off. And so, at any rate, was somebody going to ask something? I thought I saw a hand. Yeah, go ahead.
So what does that imply? What does that suggest? Like the reliability between raters was low, suggesting it's very hard for raters to understand the criteria for.
Well, I don't think it's hard for them to understand the criteria. I didn't personally train this group of graders, but I was there for the whole training and I monitored them. So we inserted validity videos, meaning videos that had already been scored by master raters, into the raters list of videos. I don't think it's hard for them to interpret the words. I think they legitimately pay attention to different evidence. I think the way framework works, it allows for people to attend to different behaviors that happen in the classroom, and then they have to make a judgment. Framework is deliberately a holistic judgment. It's not formulaic. It's not saying, was there a lesson objective on the board? Or did the teacher call on girls equally compared to boys? It's not these like small grain size things. It's very broad. I can pull it up for us. We can look at it at the very end. They're very broad judgments that the rater has to make. So I don't think it's the problem that like they're confused so much as there's not widespread agreement about what is scaffolding a kid look like. What does a high quality question look like, or a question that's cognitively demanding? There's not actual agreement about how those words map to actual behaviors. And so the raters are interpreting it and they come to different. Now, they're not all over the map. It's not a lot of 1s and 4s. They tend to come to the same part of the scale for the most part. But I guess what I would say to you is this is the reality. 3 years into the work, I'm 10 years into this work, a decade of work on observation tools. And I used to think to myself, it's got to be the training, right? Like I'm a teacher in my bones. It must be, there has to be a way to train these people better so these numbers look better. This is insanity that we cannot get these people to agree. I'm sure I said those words to Drew at one point. You're like, but when you go and you look at the history of constructed response scoring, and I don't mean to offend anyone that specializes in writing, I view written essays as a much easier prompt for a rater to score than a video. It's just simply, first of all, it's static. It's not changing and happening in real time. And these don't look that different from what we see in constructed response items. And we've been at that for hundreds of years around the globe. We've been scoring essays since the beginning of universities. So not in the systematic ways we do now, but there's huge problems with constructed response. So I do think it's the combination of like, we have a very complex stimulus, which is teaching and learning, lots of kids, lots of things happening in real time. A human rater can only do so much. And I think in this case with Danielson, we've got very big verbs and we do not have a good technical language that we agree on. And that combination produces this. We do have some instruments that produce slightly better than this, but not wildly better than this. Even the tools that are more behavioristic. Some of the tools that were created in the 70s that are very narrow, a tool that I mentioned, the global study that we're working on, we get exact agreement rates well over 75%, but I can pull that tool up and I'll show you, and you'll be like, yeah, well, of course they can agree on that. It's like so tiny. The problem with like those little tiny things is they don't really predict anything.
Right.
Yeah, we can agree it happened, but it doesn't matter that it happened.
And I
So-
can say, oh, Courtney, you made me feel so much better about our team before. I just feel like a weight is lifted off my shoulders, and I'm gonna cite you.
You're right. I'm trying to think, no, we have said this now in writing, but I'm trying to remember if that paper is in press or where that paper, I have to think where that paper is. You can definitely have a draft of it. I mean, we've honestly looked over, because, you know, as a researcher, you get this back and you're like, oh my God, well, please fire me now. This is horrible. I mean, and it's depressing, right? You work so hard with these people, like only half the time you agree. Come on. Yeah.
You can do something like Purdue looks horrible, but it's okay. 2018 personal communication.
On that happy note. But if you go to the Met report, these actually, they describe it in a different way. They do proportion of variance in the big Met report. But anyway, if you go looking, it's there. It's not, I mean, we're not out on a limb. This is what it looks like. So the third finding, the preliminary finding, is about the teacher assignment. So there's 3 types of teacher assignment comparisons we'll look at. So first, I mentioned ELA and math, and like, you know, the subject matter person in me, I was trained at Michigan State, so like I'm all about subject matter. The subject matter part of me doesn't think about the, teaching ELA or teaching math as an assignment or a feature of your teaching assignment, but in special ed it is. You know, in secondary ed, general ed, it's not. I have a major, I'm a math teacher, you know, but in special ed it is. And districts have control over how they assign teachers and which teachers and on what basis they assign teachers. So this is an assignment thing. From a policy perspective, this is an assignment issue. So that's why we treated that under this category of teacher assignment. And so you can see, I don't know if this surprises you or not. This is the first time to our knowledge anybody's looked at this in special ed observation scores, but you can see we have a little bit higher in ELA. You know, one of the things Mary said is she feels like special ed instruction is more, and this is just the instruction domain, just to remind you, she feels like there's more well-developed interventions in reading. I don't know if you guys agree with that. Yeah, than in math. I mean, I know a lot of special ed folks work on math, but so that didn't surprise her that their scores were a little higher. She thinks the curriculum materials, the training for those teachers, the PD for those teachers is a little bit better. Then when we look at elementary and secondary, so you can just look at communication. And interestingly, you see again a little bit higher in elementary school. Here is a study by my colleagues Kata at RAND and Dan at ETS. They have, it's in the Met book, they do see observations scores across. I can't remember what tool. I feel like they use two tools, maybe class and framework in that chapter. But scores go down. On average, scores are lower in middle school. And so you start to wonder, what is that about? Is that about the teacher? Is that about the students? Is that about what's being tracked in the tool itself? So we don't know what to make of that, but we see, interestingly, the reverse here. One of the things is also in special ed that Mary, Nate, and I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are, because we're still kind of analyzing the data so we can shake it harder in different ways. They've talked out loud about the idea that if kids are identified young, like say first, second, third grade, and they're getting certain interventions, they establish a kind of the child establishes kind of sense of who they are as a learner in the world. And schools don't do the kind of aggressive intervention in middle school that they do in elementary school. They don't have any data to support that, but that's their sense. And so when you go into middle school, the way that special ed kids are dealt with could be what's causing this to be dealt with, because the kids are progressing, and some of the ones that were going to be kind of easier to teach or look on the surface from Danielson's perspective to be coming along with the higher scores, those kids are going to be back in mainstream instruction. So it's possible that part of this is really just about students and where they are and how special ed works in middle school versus elementary school. I will say to you, the middle schools in the study really were in general middle schools. I don't think we had any like 7, 8. So it wasn't, we weren't dealing with K-8 schools and then we had to put them in as middle schools or something like that. There's nothing weird happening there. In general, they were 6 through 8 schools. Go ahead, Ruby.
I'm just curious, and I'm assuming then that it's not the case that in general, middle school and secondary teachers score lower on DAN.
Well, isn't that a good question? I don't know the answer to that. Do you? So much of this observation work has been done in elementary and middle schools. We did a study in
Scores are lower than elementary scores, for sure.
Yeah, that's what the Met chapter says. Yes, that's true. But that only goes in middle school, but she asked about secondary. I was thinking about high schools. I can only think of, we did a study and Met has 1 grade level. There's 9th grade scores in Met. Try to think about high school. Can I think of an observation-based study that comes in high schools? I can't. Can you?
No.
I mean,
I don't think this work's been done in high school.
I mean, I think that, so Danielson is, the main thing about that is student-centered.
Yeah, right. Constructivism. Or,
yeah, which I think probably some flavor of that happens more in elementary because, those kids have not been trained to behave yet and sit and be quiet. Even if you're bored, just be quiet.
Right.
So you kind of have to be a little more student-centered if you don't want to. That kind of goes away, I think, in high school. The expectation is that,
You sit
stand and talk, and you either take notes or don't take notes. I don't really care. And I mean, from what I've seen, and it's a very small sample, special ed teachers in middle and high, they really are kind of helping kids individually. They don't teach. They often don't necessarily understand content. Becomes harder. I am wondering if this is sort of
a relative result of that. Yeah. Here's the thing that's a puzzle to me. That's plausible hypothesis. The puzzle to me is like, how is it that districts decide who's going to be at what grade level? So is it that, and these are like teacher evaluation scores. So is it that it's easier to teach elementary kids to score higher on Danielson when you're doing elementary? Or is it that there are stronger teachers at elementary, stronger special ed teachers at elementary? And that matters for how you're going to use the score. If it's just a easier population to score high on, then now all of a sudden you've just given all these teachers like higher scores in your teacher evaluation system, but they may not be quote unquote better. So that I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's an issue for teacher evaluation.
Don't you think teachers pretty much assign themselves to either elementary or middle based on the jobs they find? I think that's more of a teacher assignment than a principal assignment. And I think
so elementary, you're K-12, right?
no,
Special ed.
Special ed is K-12.
Sorry, special ed.
But
That's what I mean.
in order to
It's
get
K-12,
a
you can
job,
apply wherever.
They just select themselves in.
you're supposed to have the content.
You have to be
In New Jersey.
Self-contained, or to teach the content, you have to be content certified. To do co-teaching, you don't need to have the content certification.
Right,
As
but,
long as
but,
there's a teacher in the classroom with the content cert.
but do we even have resource group like self-contained in middle and high?
I taught self-contained high school.
Yeah.
But it was back when you didn't have to have all the certifications.
I don't think we choose where we go. So I think that's a teacher thing, so you would almost want to look at your demographics, that would be
Yeah,
interesting.
well, and then it works against Pradeep's hypothesis, because in theory, if you're kind of more gravitating towards secondary, maybe you feel your content background is stronger, then in theory, you think maybe they'd be better at the secondary level because they selected into it. Yes, this is a tangle. This is a tangle. Drew has given me the like, Courtney, don't keep chatting. So let me keep going.
What does that face look like?
It's just a simple look, and I got it. It's like so this is the co-taught versus the resource room. So let's just take a look at that. Right? And this bears out very slightly, though. These are not big differences in that particular situation. And I already told you there's not a lot of co-teaching happening. These are lessons, not teachers. Those are lessons. 58 lessons we classified as co-teaching. Okay, so we see some differences across those teacher assignments, we'll just call it. And then the last one is really about the comparison to this QCI, which is the special ed instrument. So if you take all of the QCI scores and you divide them up into quintiles like that, and then you take the FFT scores on the same lessons and divide them up, and then you say to yourself, well, we kind of like, if it was low, if we have good validity here and they're kind of measuring the same underlying thing, we would expect there to be the people who, the lessons that were sorted in the first quintile in FFT would also be in the first quintile in QCI. So you would expect these numbers. And so what we wind up seeing is a lot of similarity. We're a little surprised. Another way to look at this is to look at, this lesson was scored in the first quintile, so low score. For FFT, and then where was I on the QCI? So you can see these things tend to group. Let's look at it a different way though. This is looking at the means. And so the range on FFT is restricted. I showed you those two scatter plots deliberately so that you could see. You saw that the instruction was more spread out, more distributed, the domain 3, and domain 2 was more compressed and a bit higher. So one interesting thing is—
This is averaged over all dimensions.
Yes, dimensions within. Yeah, this is a total score. Yeah, this is a total score. So one of the interesting things is if you look at, so this is again, FFT going 1 to 4, and QCI is scored 1 to 3, so they're on different scales, so we have to stretch them a bit. But you can see that if you say to yourself, well, for the QCI means what's the distribution of QCI scores? There's where it is, right? It's kind of clumpy here in the middle between 1.5 and roughly just between 2.5 and 3. And let's do the same thing just to orient ourselves. The FFT scores kind of fall for these lessons between 1.5 and look, they are compressed, right? So QCI is spreading out the special ed instruction in a different way than FFT is. FFT is seeing these variety of behaviors that QCI is making distinctions about. It's spreading them out across that 3-point scale. And FFT is saying, no, those things are really, those behaviors we see are really clumped down at the lower end for the instructional bit. So if we take a step back and so we can be on time here, let's think about the scoring inference, which is that first claim I talked to you about. So on several of these components, we see that special ed educators are scoring lower than you would hope for sure. And these components at least align. We saw some similarity with those red ones that we had flagged. Those might be problematic. Though there are some low scores and ones that we didn't think would necessarily be problematic. We are right now looking into some very specific lessons that have particular scoring patterns to try to see what was happening in this one, that it got scored high on QCI and low on FFT. There's a paper one of the doc students is leading on exactly that so that we can try to create images and understand why this is happening the way that it's happening. A second initial sort of conclusion is just the initial evidence suggests low levels of reliability, but this is not surprising because this is about what we see. We wish it would be higher. There appear to be some differences on teachers' assignments. We're going to shape those much harder with regression and some of the other tools. But right now we want to pay further attention to those assignments. We've also gone back to districts to ask about their assignment strategies so that we can piece together, like, does this make sense from a how we know assignment happens on the ground, the kinds of issues you were raising. And then from an extrapolation perspective, we saw similarities and differences. So kind of rank ordering is not so different between QCI. If we just line the teachers up on a total score, we're not very often saying somebody is awesome on framework and they're terrible on QCI or vice versa. So we're not seeing that really. But we see this clumping of the special ed instruction pressed down and really crowded in a certain part of the scale. So some similar, and we don't see that on the special ed tool. So there are some score quality concerns, we would say, but there are some interesting consistencies in how FFT and QCI rank order teachers. I will say, Mary the most was surprised about that because I think as a special ed teacher educator, she feels like she knows that when a teacher is doing certain instructional moves that are in tune with what students need, she really sees how those cannot be scored high on framework. The thing that, as I'll just share sort of in this room kind of situation, the thing that has been the most eye-opening and kind of depressing is Mary would say to you, the QCI scores are what worry her the most, actually. Forget about Danielson for a second and that we're doing the validity study of Danielson. She's like, we just are not seeing enough good high-quality special ed instruction. And as a general ed teacher, I just say back, and we are not seeing enough good high-quality general ed instruction. This is the way of the world right now. Go ahead, Nora.
Yeah, I was thinking actually, when you go back to talk to your participant districts and schools about how they make those assignments, one of our little side combos over here was that in our sort of lived experience in schools, a lot of times if the teacher is duly certified, they will get assigned to a special ed teaching assignment as sort of like a punishment. Like they either think they're not a good teacher, so they put them in a special ed assignment, or they think like they pissed off the administration in some way, so they get a special ed assignment. Yeah, it happens a lot.
But that has a lot to do with test scores. So this is horrible. This is only
Yeah.
but it's kind of where you can do belief
Mm-hmm.
damage.
You mean in terms of number of students, maybe?
How it affects the schools.
Oh, the
rankings and test
school
scores,
scores,
right?
right.
Alternate assess. Like some students don't take the part, they are assessed via portfolio or going to BLM.
Right.
And so sometimes they'll put teachers there because those scores are not part of
The main
overall,
accountability
their
standards.
kids, it's in their IEPs and their scores, that they're not standardly assessed.
I would be surprised. To ask that.
Some-
You have to ask
Have to
teachers.
ask that.
You have to like.
Yeah, sometimes I'm shocked what people tell us, but sometimes they, you're exactly right. They don't tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that I guess I shouldn't be surprised. It just makes me super sad for special ed kids.
We're really sad to see that.
I'm teaching an assessment course, assessment and evaluation, but like, if this is like assessing teachers, it's the same as assessing students. If your assessment tool has a kind of like consistent, like one group is lower than the other group, we may have to consider if this tool has a bias towards certain particular group. For example, like say, if a special education teachers have a consistent lower score on this assessment, which might mean like special education teachers don't do a good job, or maybe this assessment tool has certain kind of bias.
Yeah. It's not capturing.
Right. For example, like mass engagement,
Policy that has structured classrooms.
like
Yeah.
engagement and discussions, because many special ed kids have language problems. So it's much harder for them to have a discussion with
Right.
So that's not the fault of special education teacher. Yes, we need to develop more strategies for that.
All right, Judy, last question.
Hey, please.
You got it.
So that's what I totally expected us to end on, was that Danielson wasn't measuring explicit instruction enough, which is what we teach our special ed teachers.
Right.
Simply put.
Yes.
But that's not what you found.
No, that isn't. No, it isn't. And that is exactly what we went into it thinking we would find. But this is where the puzzle is. I think there is some disadvantage to special ed teachers that's bias in the tool. I think certain scales, and that's what we're going to try to ferret out more carefully. That said, when we saw that rank ordering being the same between the two tools, you can't ignore the evidence that, like, okay, there's still some underlying something that's happening here that Danielson is capturing. And they were two different sets of raters also, so it wasn't like they saw the lesson and maybe they had a bias about the lesson or something. So that's part of the reason why we're doing qualitative work, to go into the lessons to say, we want to look at the lessons that QCI scored high and Danielson scored low, and vice versa, and see if we can understand, are there certain kinds of behaviors that are problematic that don't get well captured in Danielson, that we could teach principals, hey, these are good behaviors, don't score that down. This is an appropriate behavior in this time. This is how it would fit into those big, broad verbs in Danielson. One of the things that we have promised Rhode Island is to develop like I hate to call it this because it gets really essentialized, but like a walkthrough tool that would just get attached, you know, if they have, and in Danielson they have like a placemat thing with all the Danielson rubrics on it. There would be a second one that's for special ed that reminds them about some of the practices they should be seeing and what those practices would look like at different levels. And the state really would like that, because the truth is, for better or worse, most principals were not special educators. And so they don't actually have any idea what they're looking at. Do you know what I mean? And this gets to one of the questions that's here. So we do not see large scale low rankings of special educators from teacher evaluation across states. So the story I'm telling you here of like this distribution shift down, we don't actually see that in real scores. This is a research context, and this gets back to this validity of, can you just lift up the validity of score distributions and that kind of stuff and put it in another context? So one of the things our principals in LA and another study said to us, and what principals here have said to us is, you know, I feel uncomfortable. I don't know what I'm watching. I'm not going to give this person a low score. I don't know if it's bad what they're doing or if it's good what they're doing. And so you say to yourself, okay, well, at least that person isn't going to get a bad evaluation score. But if you think about that second purpose we talked about professional learning, okay, there's like no signal in the scores that principal is assigning, because the principal does not know how to assign scores that reflect accurately what's happening. So the idea that this tool that everybody's spending a ton of time and money working with is going to direct people into professional development in the case of special ed teachers, if those scores look that way, it probably is not going to be very useful. So fine, it's not hurting them for evaluation, but it's probably not helping them for professional development or teacher growth, right?
Okay, so thank you very much. See you next week.